Thanks, Sarah. While you're doing that, I'm just going to take an opportunity just to remind everybody about the buy local campaigns that the Chamber is working on with partners at the moment. Glenturret, somehow I got muted. I don't know how I did that. Never mind. So what I was saying was, we've just come out of a weekend where we saw Small Business Saturday. It was brilliant to see so many people out and about doing their local shopping, but it's never been more important to support our local businesses. And the Chamber is involved in 2 buy local campaigns in our area. So in Angus, we've got a buy local campaign that's focusing on all those gems that exist in and around all the towns and the villages and in the virtual high streets of Angus. So we have got a Christmas hamper competition running at the moment. So you can enter, if you live in Angus, jump onto the buyangus.co.uk website and have a look at the hamper competition. It's dead simple. All you've got to do is tell us why it's so important to buy local, and then you'll be in with the chance of getting a hamper for Christmas time, just ram-packed full of brilliant Angus goodies. We'd also like to hear from you if you know of all of those Angus hotspots and the brilliant businesses and the places that you like to shop and the places that you'd like to tell everybody else about too. So on social media, we are using the hashtag #BuyAngus to share that content. So please, please, please tell us all about that so that we can amplify that and make sure once you've got your shopping that everybody else gets the chance to get out and get from those retailers and those brilliant businesses too. So that's what's happening in Angus. And in Dundee, we launched the Love Dundee Local app and website, which is a virtual high street, a place for gift shops, for food and drink businesses and all sorts of different businesses to come together in one handy app. So it's been really, really well received so far. We're really pleased with it, and we've been doing a lot of work to get businesses and merchants onto that app, but now we need people to spend their cash. So we'd really like to also hear what your experiences are of that app. So we're always going to be refreshing it and changing it and making it just the best spot possible for you to go and buy your local gifts and support your local businesses. So I guess that's a plea from me, is to remember and shop local. We are obviously in slightly restricted times at the moment, but there appears to be light in that the cases in local areas are coming down, and I would hope to see restrictions easing and helping us get out and about and really doing as much as we can to support our local businesses. So I appreciate your time this morning, and I'm really looking forward to today's event. So this is the third of our Chamber Economic Indicator that we've done this year in collaboration with Shona Dobby of Angus Economics. It's really interesting, really important work. We take lots of responses, hundreds and thousands of responses from businesses across the region, telling us about what's happening in their business, what happened in the quarter before, what they think is going to happen to their business in the coming quarter. And it's really important that we can see what the local picture is on all of that. We are part of the Scottish and the British Chambers network, and we all do this work at this every quarter. We amalgamate all our responses, but this year, for the first time, we started to actually produce our own report. And I'm really pleased that what we've also been able to do is produce a business indicator, which is all about confidence. And we've seen, as we've done these different quarters, that it's been an improving picture, which is really encouraging, particularly given what we've been going through this year, but also with the prospect of Brexit running at us at a rate of knots for the 1st of January. So even just some of the responses we got, you can see the different picture that businesses are feeling, and some businesses are enjoying increased sales and others are finding that the picture is not so positive. But we heard people say things like, what have the main reasons been for changes in your business confidence? And people talked about a new location, new marketing campaigns. They talked about having seen a good 3 months where things were picking up again. And then the other side of that coin is people saying things like, well, all trade is on hold. There's been no turnover at all since March 2020. People saying that the vaccine prospect is encouraging. Then talking about things like COVID and the lack of a Brexit deal really impacting on the business. And then other scenarios that clearly have an impact on our area as well are kind of shown when people tell us things like the oil price slump, plus the impact of COVID on aviation and maritime, so really having quite a significant impact on their operations and what they do. So in an ever-changing picture, it's brilliant to be able to hear from somebody like Shona that can take all the responses that we get and make that into a compelling report and a compelling update. So I'm really privileged to have worked with Shona in the past, and we've had a really interesting year gathering our content and really looking at these numbers and what businesses are telling us. So what we're going to do is hear from Shona as always today, and then I'll come back on and we'll have a bit of a Q&A session, a chance for you to give us your comments, and we'll just have a bit of a discussion at the end and see where we get to. So I'm going to share my screen, which is always a disaster waiting to happen, isn't it, Shona? So far, so good. Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. So let me share my screen and we'll get that moving. Here we go. Shona, over to you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Alison, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to start the presentation this morning looking at the background, the economic background that we're all living in. And so this chart's looking at GDP, which is gross domestic product, and it's one of the better measures of activity in the economy. It doesn't capture everything, but as I say, it's one of the best ones that we have at this point in time. And what this chart is looking at is the movement in GDP since the start of the year. So if the start of the year was set at 100, then where have we been and where are we now? And what you can see is that, you know, we had these really bad falls in March and April. In fact, the economy fell about 20% in April alone. But since then, we've had 5 months of growth. And the most recent report, which was for September, that was showing growth of 1.1%. So quite, normally that would be considered a relatively strong rate of growth for a month, but given where we've been, we would be hoping to have seen a higher rate of growth. We've got an update to this report coming on Thursday, and the expectations are that the rate of growth will be even more muted, maybe back down to around 0.4, 0.5%. So that's something to keep an eye on. So what the chart's telling us is that yes, we are recovering, but we're not quite back to where we were. We're still about 8-9% below the levels at the start of the year. So there's still quite a bit of catch up. And last week, the OECD said that only Argentina was probably going to perform worse than the UK. They expect growth to be down about 11% in the UK for the whole of this year, and only to recover about 4.2% next year. Now, some of that could be because of the makeup of our economy and the fact that some of our sectors are hit particularly hard by the COVID restrictions. What we're hoping to see is that, you know, we'll continue to get progress across each of the sectors. And this chart is showing the services sector, production and construction. You can see that construction was hit hardest. It actually fell 44% at the worst point, but it's made a very sharp recovery since then, and it's now down just about 7% from the peak. Production also fell by about 25% in April. Again, it's recovered, it's 8-9% below the peak, and services very similar, about 8-9% below the peak at the moment. But services account for more than 70% of our economy, so that is a really important one. If we were to look at Scotland, the picture would be very similar. The numbers are very similar, the trends are the same. And what our survey has been telling us is that the local economy is following a similar path. So when we first did this survey in Q3, we were seeing the very low numbers associated, as you would expect, with, you know, these massive drops in GDP growth. And then we saw a sharp recovery last time. And this time around, we're still seeing recovery, which is really encouraging, but the rate of that recovery seems to be just leveling off a bit. And that's something that we'll come back to as we go through the next few slides. So starting with our next one, What we've got here is the key results of our survey. And this is showing you quite a mixed picture. So last time in September, every bar on this chart was 0 or negative. So we've clearly had some encouraging positive progress. But we still have more negatives than we would like to see. So if we look at the positives first, we've had a good recovery in terms of sales revenue and orders, and that has fed through to a positive assessment of cash flow. That's moved from -8 to +16, which is really encouraging because it's often problems with cash flow rather than profitability, which force businesses to close. The assessment of wages hasn't altered from last time. It was +5 last time and it's +5 this time. So we're still seeing a slightly positive outlook for wages. If we look at the negative side though, we've got online sales. I think that's more, and that's due to a lot of the production related companies having a say in our survey, so not so many consumer facing industries, which would have had very positive online sales progress. We've also seen profits are still negative, but again, a huge improvement from last quarter. They were -26 last time. So we've seen a big jump from there. And investment still negative. We've only seen a small improvement there from -14 to -10 this time. But again, it is an improvement, so it has to give us some encouragement. But it is clearly understandable that as long as profits remain under pressure, investment is also going to be in the same boat. But the most worrying result on this chart, and for our local economy as a whole, is the sharp decline in the assessment of employment. And this has fallen from 0 to -11, and it's telling us that local businesses are now being forced to start cutting staff and laying off. This, unfortunately, nationwide trend, as you can see from the next chart, which is looking at the UK as a whole. What we see here is that the labour market was holding up with all the furlough scheme, etc., until the last couple of months, but we're now beginning to see really sharp deterioration, and this obviously is a huge concern. This chart's looking at redundancies, and they've now reached a record high. They increased by a record 181,000 in the 3 months to September, and they've reached a total of 314,000 over the year as a whole. And it's the speed of this uplift which is most worrying. And the big question is whether this trend still has further to go. Economists also look at what's called the flow into unemployment, and that's whereby workers move from employment to inactivity and then into unemployment itself. And this measurement increased by 214,000 in September. And again, that is the largest flow into unemployment on record. So we're living in uncharted times, and we know things have been bad. The question is there much further to go here? What we've seen since March is the number of people on payrolls falling by 782,000, and unemployment has risen by almost 250,000 over the last 3 reported months. So it's now at 1.62 million. The unemployment rate is 4.8%, but it's even higher for men at 5.2%. However, unemployment is a lagging indicator. It always tells us more about where we've been rather than where we're going. But I still think, this chart highlights the huge need we have for a vaccine and some return to more normal conditions. Otherwise, this unemployment problem is something which is likely to be sustained and is going to continue to drag on the economy. So we hope to see some signs of stabilisation there in the short term. Moving on to the next chart, looking at something a lot more hopeful. We're looking at sales revenue of businesses who responded to our survey. And, this is giving us more of an indication of where we're going. And it is encouraging because what we see is that sales have definitely improved since the last quarter. Every one of our net balance figures, if you see the table here, every one of those figures was negative last time, but they've now all turned positive, so that has to be good news. Biggest improvements have come in the categories of sales to the rest of the UK. Last time this was pretty weak, it was showing a reading of -23 in terms of the net balance. This time it's +4. So that is a huge improvement. But we've had an even bigger improvement in terms of export sales. So almost 60% of local companies who do export say that their sales have increased. So companies in business services and manufacturing in particular have been much more encouraging about their export sales. So that's definitely good news. We clearly have a much healthier picture of sales over the last 3 months, but we hope to see this improve even further. And something which gives us an indication of where that might go is the next chart, which is looking at the changes in orders. And again, this is quite encouraging. We're starting to see some confirmation of the view that conditions are improving, but we're still seeing that the signs that the pace of the acceleration is sort of leveling off a bit. So this chart is telling us that 68% of local businesses are saying that their orders have either improved or they've remained constant. And last time this was 61%. So yes, there is an improvement, but we would have possibly hoped to see an even bigger jump. So what's improved most? Well, once again, it's the export sector. 55% of firms who export and who responded to the survey have seen an increase in their orders, which is really encouraging. And once again, the improvement has come mainly in the manufacturing sector and in the business service sector too. This time round, they're also joined by agriculture. So we've seen positive uplifts in orders in these 3 sectors. On the downside, there's been absolutely no improvement in orders from the rest of the UK. The net balance for this category remains at -24, which is pretty weak. So that's a bit disappointing. It's been dragged down by the hospitality sector. And you know, clearly that sector in particular is still struggling with all the COVID-related restrictions, and that's having a huge impact on their orders, particularly from the rest of the UK. So I would say that the assessment of this chart is that, you know, overall conditions are improving, and that's something which, you know, we can take heart from, but the pace of that improvement is definitely slowing. So what does this mean for operating capacity? Well, this next chart looks at where we are in terms of operating capacity. And again, we've seen an increase in improvement, which is encouraging, but again, the pace of that improvement is showing some signs of slowing. So operating capacity across all the respondents was just 54% in the second quarter when we started the survey. Then it improved to 69% last time, so a huge jump. And again, we've seen a further improvement, but it's a small one. Operating capacity has moved from 69% to 71%, so an improvement of just 2%. Currently, operating capacity is highest in the manufacturing sector. That has seen a jump from 73% to 87% of operating capacity this time round. And the agricultural and the oil and gas sectors are also operating at fairly high levels, which is clearly encouraging. But there are 2 sectors which have actually seen falls in their operating capacity over the last 3 months. The first one is education, and the second one is hospitality. Education covers a whole range of business activities, some of which is like in-house training and so on. So that's probably the reason as to why operating capacity has declined in that sector. And hospitality clearly also still suffering from the restrictions of COVID-19, and they're seeing their output levels fall further, which, as I say, is clearly disappointing. And of course, operating capacity is one of the key components when it comes to making decisions about employment. And we can see some of the impact of this on the next chart. So here we're looking at the employment situation across Dundee and Angus. The chart's showing us 2 things. The sort of turquoise coloured bars are illustrating what has happened to employment on a sectoral basis over the last 3 months. And the green bars are showing businesses' expectations about what's going to happen with employment in the future. So you can see that the results are fairly mixed across the sectors. Where there are gaps, it's just telling us that the net balance is zero. So the sectors are feeling quite neutral about employment and not inclined to go one way or the other. What's encouraging, if you look at the bottom of the chart, you can see that the deterioration in employment over the last 3 months is expected now to correct from here. So we had a reading of -11 for the last 3 months, and that is expected to improve to +22 over the next 3 months. So that's showing that although firms have had to lay off staff, they are expecting to be rehiring within the next few months. And we can only hope that that comes to pass. The most negative readings regarding employment in the last 3 months, so looking at the turquoise bars, come from the hospitality sector once again, and also from manufacturing. And only the agricultural sector reported that employment was positive in the last 3 months. But looking forward, if we focus on the green bars in the chart, it's good to see that manufacturing has swung around, so it's turned much more positive. And that would fit in with the results that we've talked about so far with regard to sales and orders and operating capacity in manufacturing. Agriculture, business services and the finance sectors are also positive about future employment, but 2 sectors have turned more negative. First one is construction, and the second one is hospitality. So clearly conditions facing hospitality sector are really challenging at this point in time, and they're expecting further fall in employment. I think in terms of the construction sector, my guess is that a lot of this could be seasonal, but if there's anybody on this call from the construction sector, please feel free to correct me when we have a discussion at the end of this. Because the other information we're seeing from the construction sector is still looking very positive. So where is all this taking us? Well, this next slide is showing change in business optimism. So it's sort of adding up all of the input that businesses have given us in terms of sales, orders and investment, employment and so on. And we asked businesses, how has your optimism changed over the last 3 months and how has it changed over the last year? So the orange bars on the chart are measuring the change in confidence since the last survey, and the sort of pink purple bars, they're showing us the change in confidence from a year ago. Now obviously in an ideal world we would have all the bars on the right hand side of the chart, but clearly that isn't the case yet. So in general, what the results are telling us is that optimism has continued to improve over the last 3 months. If you look at the total reading at the bottom of the chart, it was it's now at 23. It was 10 last time. So we're seeing a big improvement. But we've not yet returned to levels of optimism which were recorded a year ago before the pandemic began. If we focus on the change in optimism over the last 3 months, we can see that arts and creative sector, the manufacturing sector, healthcare, construction and business services are all feeling more positive. And again, that ties in with what we've seen in some of the previous charts. But the 2 sectors where optimism is failing, first one, understandably, hospitality, and the second one, oil and gas sector. So these 2 sectors have actually seen their optimism decrease over the last 3 months, which is obviously a cause for concern. In the case of the oil sector, and again, this is me looking at the headline data, if there's anybody on the call working within the sector, please feel free to give us a lot more information. But we've had a big slump in the oil price. The oil price is currently around $48. Any signs that the economic recovery is going to be muted seems to push the oil price further down. There's still all the COVID-related restrictions on aviation and maritime activity, and then lots of concerns over Brexit. So, you know, lots of reasons as to why the oil and gas sector's sentiment has decreased over the last 3 months. So, moving on to the next chart, this is looking at public finances, and the reason I've put this chart into the presentation is that when we asked respondents to list some of the key topics which were concerning them at the moment, the main one that came through was taxation, and you know, it's a very popular response. People obviously concerned about taxation, and that stems from the sharp deterioration that we've seen in public finances over the last few months. And this chart is just putting into perspective what these changes have been in terms of the decrease in the health of the deficit and in the amount of national debt which we now owe. So the public sector deficit, or net borrowing, which is on the left-hand side of the chart, has clearly shot up in the last few months. It's now back up at the level last seen during the financial market crisis, and this is the figure which is causing everybody most concern. So currently our public sector deficit is running at around 10% of GDP, which is a worryingly high level. This is clearly because government spending has gone up. It's gone up by 6.4 billion over the last year, but at the same time tax receipts continue to fall. So VAT, business rates, income tax receipts are all down by about 2.7 billion in total. So we've had a 6.4 billion increase in spending, a 2.7 billion decrease in income. So the budget has deteriorated by about 9.1 billion compared to this time last year. And that works out at about £140 for every man, woman and child in the UK. The consequences of that, because it's being financed largely by debt, is that the debt level's risen too, and you can see that in the right-hand chart. Our national debt has now moved above 100% of GDP. It's reached levels last seen in the early 1960s, and at that point we were still paying off the debt which had been built up during 2 world wars. So clearly there are fears that tax is going to increase from here, but this is very different to the financial market crisis, and I suspect that the policy getting us out of here is going to be different as well. And I think a lot of lessons were learnt over the last few years about the impact of austerity and sharp cuts to public spending and increases to taxation. We're not the only country in this position by far. Every country is going through the same turmoil at the moment. Most countries are seeing their debt levels increase. Debt is cheap at the moment, and that's one good thing as far as the government is concerned. They're able to borrow very cheaply. So I think we're going to see a lot more emphasis this time round on measures to try and stimulate growth and to get activity back to where it started, rather than, you know, increasing taxation, cutting spending, which would all just dampen growth even further. But this deterioration in public finances is one of the reasons as to why the OECD has painted a pretty negative figure on the UK. And this is something that could act as a drag on the economy if we don't see some big pickup in activity soon, and a pickup in tax revenues, excuse me, and the ability for the government to start cutting back some of the additional spending which it's having to do during the pandemic. Now the next chart is looking at currencies, and sterling dollar, sterling euro in particular. Exchange rates was another of the topics which respondents highlighted as being something of concern at the moment. And I think this ties in with the fact that export markets have improved, and companies want to see if this is something which is likely to continue into the future, or whether conditions there could start to get a bit tougher. So I would say two currencies is also going to have an impact on the ability of our government to borrow cheaply, and you know the impact of international markets can be huge, and any impact on our currency has an impact on our economy. So we're looking here at the two major exchange rates for the UK, and you can see that there was a big fall in sterling, particularly against the dollar, back in March. That's when the pandemic was starting to rage in the UK. US was a little bit further behind. And at that point, sterling actually fell to its lowest against the dollar since 1985. And it was partly over questions about how the UK was going to pay for all the stimulus measures which it was introducing at that point in time. But clearly we've moved a long way since then. We're not the only country introducing all these stimulus measures. As I say, the government has shown that it's able to borrow a lot of the money it needs to pay for the stimulus. And we've seen sterling recovering sharply since then. And we've still got a long way to go to the end of the year in terms of politics and economics, but currently it does look as if sterling could end the year even higher against the dollar than where it started. But sterling's performance against the euro in the lower line, it's not been so good. It's surely related largely to the politics of trying to reach a decision over Brexit. And yet again, I'm going to say, I think we will have a decision within the next few days. But yet again, we might still be hanging on to the very last minute at the end of this month. The most recent forecasts that I've seen for sterling euro say that, you know, if we do reach a deal with the Europeans, sterling would jump, and it could jump as high as €1.25. That would actually be the highest since June 2016, when the whole sort of Brexit process began. If that happens, it's obviously more challenging for exporters because it makes our goods less competitive. But it means that our costs would be lower because sterling would be stronger. So our import costs would be a bit lower. If we get no deal, then the forecasts are that sterling could fall to about €1.05, and it could drop to about $1.10. Which is obviously fairly weak, and a bigger move in the dollar than in the euro, which is already sort of putting in some of these implications. So we've still got a very volatile situation, some major implications for competitiveness, for costs, for pricing, and hopefully we're going to see some certainty soon. But I'm sure Brexit is a topic which will come up when we have our discussion at the end of the presentation. So moving on from here, starting to look at what companies are saying they're now expecting looking forward. And this chart is looking at the revenue expectations for the next 3 months. It's an encouraging chart with all this uncertainty about Brexit, etc. It's really encouraging to see that revenue expectations have increased sharply in our survey. And once again, though, the rate of improvement is showing some signs of slowing down. So all the net balance numbers in the table are positive. That is definitely encouraging. But the net balances overall and for Scotland were actually higher last time than they are now today. So I mean, last time they were giving us revenue expectations for the next 3 months, which we've lived through now. So now companies are looking forward to the sort of move into 2021. So companies this time around much more positive about export sales. So that ties in with what we've seen in the sales and orders numbers. 47% of companies who export say that they expect their sales to increase further over the next 3 months. So as I say, that's definitely encouraging news. If we were to look at these revenue expectations on a sector basis, we would see that expectations are highest for agriculture, arts and creative sector, and also the healthcare sectors. The two sectors that appear to be most concerned about future revenue, at least in the near term, and I should offer a prize for guessing these. But the first one is hospitality and the second one is oil and gas. So again, we're seeing a very consistent message coming through in the survey results. And the fact that both sectors are feeling more concerned about future revenue explains as to why, when we looked in the previous chart at optimism, these were the two sectors which were clearly lagging. So hospitality and oil and gas definitely much more concerned about future activity than the other sectors that we're monitoring in this survey. If we move on to the next chart, what we're looking at here is the operational impact of COVID. So the changes which businesses have had to make. And I think this chart, as last time, just highlights the flexibility of businesses in their ability to make changes in a fairly short order of time, and to be able to be up and running and to have reached the point where they have reached today in terms of activity once again. So the most popular change that we've seen has unfortunately been a reduction in staff hours, and that ties in with the weaker employment numbers which we've seen in the survey. But a fairly large percentage of companies have also made changes to their products and services, or to their office or workshop space to comply with the rules about social distancing. And flexible working's also been relatively high on the agenda. This is obviously easier for some sectors than others, but it could be a change which is here to stay in some form or other, even after we emerge from the COVID pandemic. So as I say, the chart is highlighting some of the costs which businesses have had to incur over the last 3-6 months in making their businesses sort of COVID proof. But I think we do have to take heart from the fact that they've been able to do this. And these are fairly high percentages of companies which have been able to make some fairly big changes to their operating practices. So what are businesses now expecting the future to bring, given that we have a vaccine starting to be administered today, which is clearly positive news? Well, this next chart shows us expectations of future business prospects. What it's telling us is that we've got a big improvement in expectations of the future across the key sectors. Agriculture, the arts, education and healthcare, clearly the most positive about the year ahead. Each of these sectors has got a net balance reading of 100%. That tells us that every firm who responded from that sector is expecting their business prospects to improve. So any time that you see a reading of 100 in these charts, it's not that the scale of the improvement is going to be so big, it's the fact that every company in the sector is expecting an improvement. And that clearly is an encouraging move. If you look at business services and manufacturing, they're also relatively confident. And we're seeing two sectors which have recorded zero balances, so that's construction and the finance sectors. That reading of zero just tells us that companies in that sector are equally balanced as to whether they think prospects are going to deteriorate or to improve. So pretty much they're expecting conditions to stay the same as they are at the moment. And as we've said, construction has seen a big improvement up to this point in time. And finance and insurance services is a sector which has been able to introduce home working fairly easily, and we haven't seen any sort of declines in that sector to the same extent that we've seen in others. So these results would seem to be quite consistent with other results in our survey. But two sectors that stand out because they've got a more negative interpretation of future prospects are once again hospitality and oil and gas. So again, that's sad to see, but it's fitting in with everything else that these sectors are telling us in the survey. We know that restrictions are really challenging for the hospitality sector, and unfortunately they're likely to remain so until we see an end to social distancing. and the oil and gas sector, as I said, being hit by the weakness in the oil price at the moment, among other concerns. So this is the consistent message that's coming through, that most sectors are feeling much more confident looking forward. Some sectors not expecting much change, and unfortunately hospitality and oil and gas still expecting to change, to experience very challenging conditions. So this next chart and our final chart pulls everything together that we've talked about. So it's looking at all the current related indicators and all the future related indicators and pulling them together into our business sentiment indicator. And what this is telling us is, we've got two lines here. We've got the sort of pink purple line at the top, which is expectations, and then the darker line is showing current conditions. So the one showing current conditions moved from -39 back in Q2 to -10, so a big improvement last quarter. And yet again, what we're seeing is an improvement, which is definitely encouraging, but that rate of change just sort of slowing down a bit. So we've moved this time to a reading of -2. So we're getting very near moving back into positive territory, and that would be really encouraging if we could see that when we do the next survey in the first quarter. The lighter coloured line above the chart is showing us expectations, and it's encouraging to see that this has also improved further. It's moved to a reading of 17. It peaked at 33 last in Q1 of this year, and that was before the pandemic. So there's still a long way to go to get back to sort of pre-pandemic levels. But a reading of 17 is definitely encouraging and not something to be too concerned about at the moment. When we create an index like this or use it, we also look at the gap between the two lines and whether this is positive or negative. And it's always encouraging if the expectations index is above the current conditions index, because that tells us that businesses are feeling more optimistic about the future than they are even about current conditions. And that tells us that they're more likely to invest and even to hire more employees. So in Q1, the gap between the two indices was 19 points. This increased to 44 points in Q2. That's when conditions were really dire. And the gap has since closed to 20 points in Q3 and 19 points today. So the fact that expectations has always remained above current conditions, is sending us a consistent message that, okay, this might go on for a long time, but it is a temporary blip, and that, eventually we will see things returning to normal. So businesses are keeping that sort of optimism in their heads, even as conditions have been dire. And what we're now seeing from the current conditions indicator is that hopefully we're almost on the verge of moving back into positive territory. So as I see, that's something that we hope to see next time round, and can only encourage everybody to fill in the forms when they get sent out sometime in February or March. So that's all from me at the moment. Hand back to Alison.
Thanks, Shona. That was, as always, really interesting. Anybody that's got any questions or wants to jump into the chat, please feel free to do so. Shona, I've got a few notes and a few things just to kind of ask you about, I suppose. Very interesting, I think, the optimism around exports, and I was about to ask about currency and whether you feel that Brexit is already impacted in your kind of currency charts. And you definitely talked about the impacts look like perhaps they're already factored in, but is there anything you can say about that? Is it something that will just unwind itself during December? It's clear really that the prospect of a no deal would be a fairly disastrous impact on currency and then the costs of our kind of international businesses. So, it's, I guess, something that we've got to be, government are not unaware of the impact that will have on business, but yeah, just would be interested if there was anything else you wanted to add on that at all.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, I think, I mean, currency is obviously the indicator which will move most quickly and which will express the views of international investors about what is happening in the UK. So if we do see a deal being struck, I think there will be relief and more confidence, just because it suggests that we won't have this sort of period of dramatic change. You know, that yes, there will be, I think there will still be delays at the borders, just because there's, you know, one way or the other, there's still going to be a lot of paperwork to be done, which firms haven't had to do for, I think it's almost 40 years or something since they had to fill in all these custom declarations. So at least in the early stages, and the pandemic doesn't help here, there is likely to be slight disruption. Hopefully we're just talking a few days, but again, you know, if anybody's got any experience of this, they're much more able to talk knowledgeably about this than me just sitting looking at the data. I think if we, as I say, the currency would move with a sort of relief rally, just that the uncertainty is over. The one thing markets hate is uncertainty. They would rather have bad news usually and at least know what they're dealing with than just this sort of, it could be this or it could be that, and as I say, not actually knowing one way or the other. So the currency will move when we do see a decision. I think the problem at the moment is that it's clearly a political issue now. I mean, it's not really about economic issues. It's the sort of sticking points. I mean, fishing as a part of the economy, it's tiny, but politically it punches way above its weight. And you know, there's so much sort of I think a lot of British fishermen feel that they were hard done by in the 70s, and so they see this as being the time in which they can redress some of these balances and get back onto a more even playing field. But as I say, it's not, as a percentage of the economy, it's way under 1%, but it's such an important issue. And the other sticking points are the sort of level playing field, which the Europeans are concerned about because we're so close to Europe in geographical distance, and that, you know, there is concern that our companies would be able to effectively sort of dump cheaper subsidised goods in their market. And then the third one is about who's actually controlling the whole of this transition and the sort of the power of the European Court of Justice. So again, it's more of a political sticking point, and that makes it hard from an economics point of view to really sort of pinpoint where this is likely to go. But I do think there'll be one way or the other minor disruption, but clearly if there's no deal, then we're talking huge changes in the way that things are done, and likely to be more disruption in the short term. That's not to say that, you know, longer term things don't improve again, because they probably would. It's just a question of the disruption, the uncertainty.
Yeah. Were you surprised, thinking about Brexit and the employment and future prospects? I mean, there's still going to be the projected impact on particularly agriculture and some of our local sectors that are potentially going to be impacted by Brexit rules as we kind of move into next year. So were you surprised that hasn't really shown itself in the numbers? Is it something that would show itself in our numbers?
I think some of the concerns, I mean, certainly we, when we asked businesses about their optimism and comparing how they feel today with 3 months ago and a year ago, we also ask, why are you feeling this way? And Brexit is something which comes up frequently. So we know that local businesses are concerned about Brexit and the uncertainty around it. It was encouraging in this survey to see the sort of bounce back in exports. Clearly they had been hit hard in previous quarters, and there's definitely a lot of recovery there. But even in terms of outlook, there was still a lot of optimism going forward, which is encouraging. I mean, it takes, usually in terms of trade, we economists say it takes about 6 months to work through. So if you see a big move in the currency, it's about 6 months, because orders are signed so far in advance before you see things actually changing. But again, you know, if we've got any exporters on this call, it would be really interesting to hear their opinion about, you know, what's happening and how they're finding the new process. Because we're seeing the government certainly trying to sort of chivvy everybody along. We're seeing all these adverts on television, etc., about, you know, getting all the form filling processes up to speed. But it's clearly, it's one thing to watch these from afar on TV, it's another thing to be actually involved in the process. So it would be interesting to hear from anybody who's got experience of it.
Through our British Chambers of Commerce network, we know that there are, I mean, they have got a swathe of what we'd call unanswered Brexit questions, which we're continuing to really kind of push for. And what the picture, I think, locally from our local exporters is still quite positive, but every chamber that deals with exporters deals with a sort of a bubble, a regional bubble, and our bubble tends to be pretty strong at this time of year because there are so many seed potatoes that are exported from this part of the world across into Europe and then into places like Morocco and Egypt and whatnot. So it tends to be a very high quarter for exporters. But then, as you've also shown, you know, I think manufacturing is sort of enjoying a particularly busy spell at the moment too. And I think we've seen, you know, from talking to our international members, a lot of people have looked for new markets over the last few years and are making the most of that. But we're also seeing a lot of demand. I mean, we've run a couple of international virtual trade missions where we're about to do more in the next quarter. And I think more and more businesses are looking at their peers that are doing it and thinking, oh, I could do that, or I could reach new markets. So it's definitely an interesting time. And I think I suppose this is my question or comment, is that, you know, our economy is not all eggs in one basket, and I think that protects us in some way because we have got a number of sectors that you know will help where another one might be lagging behind. So, you know, I guess that's probably isn't a question, but the question maybe is around where we might be exposed. And there was a couple of sectors, construction and education, that showed slightly different pictures, I think, in some of the stories you were telling, Shona, because there was clear difficulties in terms of productivity, and yet actually their optimism was quite strong. So I wondered, you know, I mean, we've talked in the past about the education sector and how much of an important sector that is for our region, not only because it employs a lot of people, but, you know, the kind of the impact then of the student spend and of the supply chain into the education sector. So they seem to be relatively optimistic. I wondered if there was anything in particular coming out of education that was worth us just highlighting, Shona.
I think the education sector overall clearly has had an improvement in sentiment and conditions over the last 3 months, just as schools returned, universities returned, colleges, etc. I think a lot of the respondents in our survey, and again, there's a bit of guesswork here because nobody's identified in the survey, you know, it's all anonymous, so I'm speculating here, but I think some of our respondents are working more in the training, one-to-one or one-to-small group type of education situations, and that clearly is a totally different situation because most things are having to be done on Zoom or Teams, etc. at the moment, and does make life much more difficult for that kind of company. So I think within the sector, there's probably two different paths being followed, and that's why sometimes we see slightly, you know, results that can sort of appear to vary with each other. In terms of construction, if you remember the very first chart looking at GDP, I mean, construction had a dire time. initially in the pandemic when everything was shut down. It fell 44%. I mean, unprecedented. Basically everything came to a stop. And so there was this massive bounce back, which was very encouraging. And we're still, I think, just, you know, at the sort of tail end of that. But then we're obviously coming into this sort of seasonal effect for that sector where construction always dips, particularly in the first quarter if the weather is bad. So I could understand why sentiment looking forward the next 3 months is going to be slightly more muted than, you know, assessing the last few months, just because you're coming into a more challenging time of year. So again, I think there's some reasons as to why we're seeing the numbers there that we have done.
And hospitality is obviously massively impacted. It's another sector that really actually seems to be bearing the brunt of the pandemic and the restrictions that we're seeing. And I wonder, and you may, I'm slightly throwing this at you, sorry for doing this, but I wondered if there's a similar picture everywhere, or whether, you know, the UK's response to kind of how we've handled the pandemic has had an extra difficult impact on hospitality. I guess one of the reasons that I'm asking is that I've seen today on social media quite a large exhibition take place in real life in Dubai, and while it's not rammed with people, you know, there are countries that have seemed to have got back to a level of normality an awful lot quicker than we have, and our hospitality sector are you know, and people that supply to the industry are really struggling, aren't they? So is it a sort of a global wide impact that hospitality is seeing?
I think globally it's a bit mixed. I mean, countries in Asia in particular are more used to dealing with health issues and pandemic type of threats. So, you know, they seem to get their sort of track and trace type systems and that up and running more quickly and get back to some form of normality more quickly than we have, where it's all alien to us, and there's definitely been a learning process. In terms of a lot of the data, which I see as an economist, definitely, yes. I mean, hospitality everywhere is, because of social distancing, it's the sector which is extremely challenged. But the beauty of doing surveys like this is that you pick up changes in the trend from the ground up. So by the time it gets to the headline numbers, it's kind of old news. So that's what I love about this survey, that, you know, we're hearing from companies on the ground what they're doing today and tomorrow, and that will begin to sort of all add up to make a picture, which is what we're trying to do here, of what's happening across Dundee and Angus, and that then builds up and will eventually turn up in the Scottish numbers and then in the UK numbers. So I would say, in terms of the data that I see at the headline level, it's kind of lagging a bit compared to what we're seeing from the survey. But using that, the trend is definitely that in countries which are using the same type of policy as we are, of social distancing, tier systems and so on, there's a clear hit to hospitality, because hospitality is the one which bounces around from one, you know, depending on what tier you're put into. And, you know, we'll see later today what tier Dundee's going to be in for the next few weeks. You've also had country, you know, like in America and so on, they haven't shut things down as much and the activity has continued, but now we're seeing a massive spike again in number of cases, and it suggests that people will start to self-isolate themselves, even if it's not policy. And so you're constantly moving from spurts of activity to sort of downward moves again, and it's very hard to get proper reading of where we are, because it's still very volatile. So I don't think I've answered your question. I've just talked around some of the issues.
Yeah, no, but and I think that what's interesting is the other thing that I was going to ask or talk about was, I was surprised that we weren't seeing a kind of a more damp employment outlook particularly for the next quarter, because we've obviously got the furlough scheme due to come to an end at the end of March, and I thought perhaps that would have kind of shown itself more. So do you think maybe it's just that it's not quite, you know, given the timing of when we were asking our questions, the furlough scheme had been extended? So I guess that's a positive to my mind.
Yeah, I think last time round, to be honest, I was surprised that employment held up so well in our regional survey, because it just seemed like, with so many cuts having to be made to working hours and so on, that I had expected to see some decrease in employment. But clearly with furlough schemes and, you know, optimism looking forward and companies trying to keep their employees on their books as long as possible, we didn't see any deterioration last time. This time round, we did see a deterioration in employment, which does unfortunately make a lot of sense, you know, given where we are. I personally will be very happy if people's predictions come to fruition in the next 3 months. I think if there's some aspect of the survey that maybe we'll be slightly disappointed on next time, it could be employment. And the reason I say that is employment, as I said before, is a lagging indicator. So you'll see other variables improving first. And often companies just, I mean, they'll stretch the resources before taking on extra employees, and that's totally understandable, particularly in these sort of disruptive times. So I hope and, you know, really want to see the employment process play out as our survey's telling us it's likely to do over the next 3 months, with, you know, some job hirings, and that would be absolutely brilliant. But if you ask me which variable I'm most concerned about, that's the one which would cause me sleepless nights, because I think, unfortunately, we're still going to see the labour market weaken a bit from here, nationally, if not in this area.
Yeah, I never miss an opportunity, do I, to talk about a chamber thing, but it would be utterly remiss of me not to talk about the Kickstart scheme. And our chamber, like many other and other gateway organisations around the country, is desperately waiting for DWP to confirm, you know, that we can get these placements moving. They opened the Kickstart scheme in just towards the end of September, and a number of other gateways like us are going through the process of gathering, you know, job placements. We're sitting on something like 120 job placements. The businesses are just desperate to get young people out of the universal credit ranks and on to sort of really good 6-month job placements. And I think that would, you know, it's one scheme that would actually have a really big impact on that national picture, isn't it? So fingers crossed. I know Donna and our team will be doing the same thing. But, you know, it's not just us. I've seen FSB say today or yesterday that, you know, their partnership with Adecco looks like they've got 700 jobs nationally waiting just to be placed and to get people back into work. So that will really have a big impact. And I would say, you know, no matter the size of your business, you should be able to through us host a Kickstart trainee for 6 months and have the UK government pick up 25 hours a week of their wage. So I would definitely encourage you all to chat to us. Although, as I've said, you know, we're waiting for them to sign off on a number of bids that we've got in, so it's taken a bit longer than we would definitely have liked, but it is making its way through the process. Doug has put in a question which I think is tied into what I might have been asking, but he's asking it in a much better way. So Shona, I'm just going to read this word for word. Any idea of just how much sensitivity the COVID funding could have on the positive revenue and cash flow improvements on the key results slide?
Sorry, could you just read that again?
I can, yeah. Any idea of just how much sensitivity COVID funding would have on the positive revenue and cash flow improvements on the key results slide? And while you're looking at that, and I might distract you with my own question of it, I guess I was also interested in, we've talked, I think, before about the possible detrimental impact of the COVID borrowing that businesses have got, and what that might do in Q1 and Q2 as some of that begins to play its way out into starting to need repaid. So I'm wondering, Doug, you can come on and correct me if that's not really the slant your question was after. So please feel free to unmute yourself and come in.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, that's exactly the point. I mean, I guess a lot of my client base were local businesses, and they're surviving through this on the funding, and they're asking what's going to happen next year. They're going to have to start paying bounce back loans back. Is furlough going to carry on? I just thought, looking at the key results slides, it actually looked really good in terms of the change quarter on quarter. But is that revenue number, is that cash flow number really just buoyed by the government funding that's there just now, and not really a reflection of, if you like, business activity? I just wonder if there's any thoughts on the sensitivity around that.
Hi, Doug. Yeah, I mean, I think the policies of the government have been designed to do exactly this, you know, to keep activity going. So in terms of the boost in sales revenue for local businesses, part of it has been just the ability to be more active again, and you know, with some of the easing of restrictions to activity. So you know, there's been that sort of improvement, but also the fact that through the furlough scheme and some of the other forms of support, the government's just trying to keep everybody going. And so if your wages are being paid through the furlough scheme, you're still able to go out and spend on other goods and services. And as a company, okay, you're more restricted in what you can do if your workers are furloughed. But I think you can still do training. And you know, there's some parts of activity which can continue. So I think the scheme has had an impact in the extent that it's holding the economy up, and it's just sort of, you know, trying to lift us all up until we can get through this, in which then when we do get put back down on the ground, we're able to sort of run away on our own. That's the whole point of this type of policy. But timing is going to be the big issue. And as we saw, you know, at the start, the furlough scheme was just going to run for a short period of time. Then it was extended, slightly changed, extended now to the end of March. Who knows where we'll be at the end of March? And I think a lot now is going to depend on the vaccine and the extent to which they're able to roll that out and start to get some activity going again. But then also issues like Brexit and the impact which, you know, that's having on businesses. So in answer to your question, I would say, yes, it definitely has had an effect, and that was the whole point of it. And it's definitely encouraging to see that. But as always, the question is, can it now be maintained moving forward?
Thanks, Shona. We've often talked, I think, about the taxation and that being something that really, really concerns business. And as a chamber network, we have been calling for the non-domestic rates review to be re-reviewed and just the whole remit of kind of business costs to be considered and be considered really carefully. But are we seeing anything in our responses? Businesses are saying that taxation is a concern to them. Is that tied into the possible investment, the public sector investment as a result of that? Do businesses want to see increased investment? Do you think that they would wear a kind of a different taxation regime in order to see those investments? Or, you know, are we likely to head for something that's like Scandinavia, or is it really more that businesses would just like to see their own costs really reduced in order for them to kind of make their own decisions and do their own investing, rather than it be at kind of the national level?
I think from the results of the survey, it would be the latter one. Businesses want to have the ability to do what they need to do, and not be held by regulation, taxation, you know, any other sort of impediment. In the survey, we do ask respondents, you know, which of the factors are of concern to them, and usually business rates is right up there, but this time round, no. I mean, obviously there's been a business rate holiday for, and it's interesting that, you know, in the last couple of days, we've seen that the big supermarket chains have returned to the Exchequer about 2 billion in business relief, because obviously they've been able to keep trading. And there's calls that what the government should do with that money is use it to help the hospitality sector. So it'll be interesting to see if we do see any moves of that kind in the coming weeks. I mean, clearly at the moment, the government is doing everything it can to keep businesses afloat and to keep activity going. The piper will have to be paid at some day. And what we hope is that the way this is done is through activity rebounding. So once we're all allowed out and about again, and we're all going to just go out, have a fantastic time like the 1920s, and just party, holiday, spend. And in that case, you know, the government will receive a lot more income again. If that doesn't happen, and if we recover in a much more muted fashion, that's when I think then the decisions get much more difficult, and there's a question of imposing more taxes again on the corporate sector and, you know, on everybody. But that, I think, is a very delicate balancing act that they have to do, and I think as of this moment, they're still minded to keep activity going at any cost, and that's why they've extended the furlough scheme out to March. It's just like, whatever it takes, just keep everything going and get through this.
I think also then, you know, there's a level of our own responsibility in that then, isn't there? I mean, we can shout from the rooftops about the improved optimism and business sentiment, and you know, there's probably something around a self-fulfilling prophecy in that, isn't there? Because as you say, you know, if we begin to feel like the picture locally is really positive, then that has a knock-on effect on our behaviour, on what, you know, people in our businesses will do and spend. And I guess every high street in every city is really looking at what's going to be the impact of I guess a blended model of work. And you know, there will be a lot of businesses still struggling because their normal customers are just not in their normal places of work. And I think, you know, we've then got to encourage businesses to really continue to invest in some of these measures that will help them, because we've seen productivity be a challenge. We've seen it be improved, I think, by those that can adopt and be flexible to their new policies. But I think the next year is going to be a really interesting one in terms of just a rebalancing of where people will be and where we'll be spending our money. So yeah, really important, and some really interesting pieces in our survey. And I love, well, I think you know me, Shona, I'm a little bit competitive, so I really think that you said that we're seeing things first that are going to play themselves out at a national picture, so that's always good too. So I think we don't have any more questions, and I think I will just take a bit of time just to wrap up, and we're going to hear a few words from Tracy at the Glenturret, who's had a chance to join us. Had interesting conversation with Tracy, with one of your colleagues. We do a take a seat interview, and we got the chance to sit down and just talk a little bit about, you know, some of the things that had been happening, the kind of the work that had been going on to rebrand, but also just the real detrimental impact, because you would normally have so many people through your doors and be enjoying all these tours, and we would be encouraging people to come and kind of take part in those tours, and it's a beautiful distillery. So no pressure on you now to kind of say a few words and just sell it to us virtually, Tracy.
Sure, yeah, well, thank you for the invite to come along this morning, and apologies I was late, had some technical issues this morning and didn't manage to come in until you'd all started. But yeah, just Glenturret Distillery, it's, as you say, it's a beautiful distillery. We did quite a bit of research over the past few months, and we'd always said we were probably one of the oldest distilleries working in Scotland. We used to have a date of 1775 that we knew we'd been established and were running from. But we've actually managed to trace that back to 1763, and the research indicates that the distillery was well up and running then, so it's likely to predate that. But we can't find anything definitive, so we can pretty much say we are the oldest working distillery in Scotland, which is brilliant, and it still really retains that character of your kind of old style whisky distillery. And there's, because it's hidden away in the woods as well, it did run illicitly for a number of years. I must say that's quite a bit in the past now. So the fact that it was hidden away in the trees next to a water source as well, it's beautifully situated. And Alison, you're absolutely right. We would normally have been sitting back after a really busy summer of tourists coming in for tours, for tastings, for lunch, for dinner, for events, for all sorts. But none of that's really happened this year. What was fantastic was that we managed to be one of the first distilleries to be back up and open for tours in July. And we went from taking tours of 25 at a time, up to 25 at a time round, to taking groups of 6 rounds, so quite a jump down in numbers, but we made the decision that we would rather be open and we would like to kind of have something for people to come to. And we were really busy when we first opened, and people had to book online, so we were regularly booked up 2-3 days in advance. We managed to open for tours, we managed to open our gift shop, we managed to open our cafe, and we also have kind of picnic areas to sit out as well. So we did have quite a nice little business going, a fraction of what we would normally have done, but it was brilliant to have something, and people seemed to really appreciate that there was something to come out to visit, because I think that's been one of the big issues after the big lockdown. Can people do that feels safe as well? And so we kind of worked quite hard to make sure that people were socially distanced on site and they felt safe, and then everything ran kind of safely, because we also had to protect the team who make our whisky. We're a small team. There are 5 men who make the whisky, and it would have been quite devastating if one of them was to have to take time out through illness and the rest of them were to have to self-isolate. And that we might not see the impact of that for 10 years, but that interruption in production would be a big impact on us as a small business. So yeah, July we managed to open. We did take the decision to close a couple of weeks ago just due to the current restrictions. No one can really travel. We didn't want to be seen to be encouraging people to travel when they shouldn't be either. So we took the decision to close. We'll reopen on the 1st of February. And we had a number of really exciting developments that were due to, or were scheduled to open earlier this year, but because our constructions had to stop on site because of a number of reasons, we really had to put all of that back. So on the 1st of February, when we reopen, we'll reopen with a gorgeous new gift shop and a stunning new cafe. And then a month later, we will launch a fabulous restaurant, which will be a kind of a really special restaurant, more a kind of dining experience with a kind of French chef. We're now owned by the Lalique Group, so there's a nice kind of French influence coming in there, kind of reigniting the old alliance, if you like. Yeah, so we've got that lovely kind of French alliance as well with a French chef, some fantastic Scottish ingredients, a beautiful restaurant. So we're really excited about that. That'll be great in March. And what we'll also unveil then is a Lalique boutique, so a more exclusive shop as part of the experience as well. So we've got lots of really good things coming up. Just now is a bit tough because we're closed at the moment, but our whisky production is still running. Our website is still open for orders. We run a kind of lovely kind of membership group that's completely free to join, to sign up to. I would encourage you all to have a look and sign up if you can. It's called the Guild of Glenturret, and it just keeps you up to date with all the news we have going on. We've got some great maiden releases as well if you're looking for any lovely Christmas gifts. We've got all sorts, from a lovely 10-year-old right up to a 33-year-old in a beautiful Lalique designed crystal decanter that's a kind of limited edition. So something for every budget. Yeah.
Brilliant. So I think that, I mean, what a brilliant way to finish, because you've talked about there have been impacts of what's happened in this year. You've changed and done a whole bunch of kind of different things. people can still spend their money with you. There's a whole lot of interesting things coming up when restrictions begin to ease. And I think that's just a really lovely way to finish. So thank you so much, Tracy, for coming on. Shona, massive thank you to you, as always, for the enormous amount of hard work that you put into this economic indicator. Thank you to Wendy Maltman at the Malting House for helping us with our report and our slides and just making it all look so good. And brilliant, well done to Sarah for getting us here, getting us live on Facebook, and for her hard work as always. So thanks to you all for taking part, for joining us today. And if you're watching us on YouTube, it's been a blast as always, and we hope to see you and your results in our next quarter. So thank you very much for taking the time to tune in, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thanks, folks.